No, Clancy is not going to become a bishop of Dima when this is all over. He will not be joining the ranks of the Nine. Clancy already was a bishop, and maybe still is. Have you ever wondered why Clancy seized Keons in particular? Or how he even knew that Keons' corpse was available to be seized? Have you maybe paused for a moment longer and thought to yourself, who is Keons? Why is this bishop so interested in helping Clancy? Or perhaps you've even gone so far as to question that video, entitled I Am Clancy, which was supposed to be the official narrative of the lore, and thought to yourself, is it fully accurate? Can it be trusted? Of those three questions, I believe the second to be the most central, and one which it is very important to have answered thoroughly, and it is that task which I will be undertaking in this video. So, let us look at the second question first. Who is Keons? For a figure who plays such an important and narrative-altering role in the story, very little is actually known about him. But we have been able to piece together a few facts over the years. Firstly, he is one of the 9 bishops of Dima. This was revealed many years ago, before Trench had even come out. And he is the bishop associated with the song Heavy Dirty Soul, which will become important in a moment. As with the other bishops in Dima, Keons rules over one of the villages inside the city, and also has control of one of the 9 towers. He's also, significantly, Clancy's bishop, meaning that he rules over the village Clancy lives in. This means that we get to learn a bit more about him than any of the other bishops, with the obvious exception of Nico. Clancy describes him as the kindest of all the bishops, actually showing care for his citizens, and with perhaps the implication that he is not always fully on board with what the other bishops are doing. Allow me to read this entry from Clancy's journal for a more expanded description. Of Dima's 9 bishops, Keons was revered as unwavering and forthright, possessing the ability to achieve focus that was rare for most in our region. We all admired him and felt honored to be inhabitants of his region. While we had heard legend of the ruthlessness of other bishops, Keons possessed a stoic candor unlike anything I had ever met, and we were all proud to serve. Now, Keons is also described in a later letter as the bishop who tracks down Clancy and brings him back into the city of Dima. And this is where things start to get really interesting. But to fully appreciate how interesting, we first need to return to that third question regarding the I Am Clancy video and its supposed accuracy. Because when we look at these journal entries about Clancy's role in the story, and then consider what the I Am Clancy video tells us about the narrative and the story as a whole, the accounts do not line up. Yet they are both, supposedly, from Clancy. Take for instance the events of the video for Jumpsuit, in which Clancy, having escaped Dima, is wandering through the wilderness of Trench. He is tracked down by a bishop on a white horse, smeared, and taken back into the city. In his journal, Clancy clearly tells us that bishop is Keons, but in the I Am Clancy video, we are informed that it is Nico, or Blurryface. And this disconnect also shows up in Heavy Dirty Soul, although perhaps not quite as explicitly. But again, in the I Am Clancy video, we are told that Nico takes Clancy out of the city in a car, before Clancy creates a fiery diversion. But this explanation has never quite sat right with me, for 2 reasons. Firstly, there is no explanation offered for how Clancy tricked Nico into taking him outside the city walls. It certainly is very unlike the Blurryface that is described throughout the rest of the story, one who is very concerned about keeping all the inhabitants inside the city, and not letting them know anything about the world of Trench beyond the walls of Dima. However, I could be more easily convinced that Keons relented, or was convinced by Clancy to drive him through Trench, given what we know about that bishop's character. Secondly, and this supports that idea, Keons is the bishop associated with Heavy Dirty Soul. Remember, I told you that would be important later on. And in fact, until the I Am Clancy video came out, the mainstream theory was that Keons was the bishop we see in that video, driving the car. So what's going on? Why do we have 2 official accounts of the lore which appear to be in direct contradiction? Well, I think the explanation is actually quite simple, and it's something which I hinted at previously in my discussion of Jumpsuit itself. These 2 accounts are different because they are coming from 2 different versions of Clancy. Not, mind you, 2 wholly separate people both taking on Clancy's identity. They are both the same person, but just existing at different times. Remember, this is a story of cycles repeating. So one version of Clancy was taken out of the city by Nico and brought back into the city by Nico. Another later version was brought out of the city by Keons and taken back to the city by Keons. Both accounts are true, They just happen at different times. So in other words, the I Am Clancy account of the lore is true, but it jumbles up the truth. It mixes up various accounts of at least 2 different versions of Clancy into one, which is why we are left with these inconsistencies. Which is why I think it is worthwhile to provide an additional, but not alternate, explanation for the events of Heavy Dirty Soul, and why Keons is associated with that song. It is not just because he drives a version of Clancy outside Dima. It is also because it is in this song and video that we are first introduced to the version of Clancy who will later go on to become Keons. But now let us return to that first question posed at the start of this video. Why does Clancy seize Keons? Or more importantly, how does Clancy know that he can seize Keons? Just after the events of the Outside, Clancy writes a rather lengthy entry in his journal, so perhaps that will help us answer this question. Let's take a look. What is this thing, this device, this gift? Some sort of neurological connection or expansion, psychokinetic weapon? This is absurd. Why was this given to me? And then let's skip ahead a little bit. It feels oddly familiar. Not the spikes in my hand, but the power it harnesses. I felt it before. So how had Clancy come across this power in the past? Why did it feel so familiar to him? According to the official narrative of the lore, Clancy had never handled or wielded this power before, but he has been controlled by it, which leads us to yet another passage. It all begins to make sense. The episodes I would have, the blood-red vision, my dreams of flying. The out-of-body account of the rider in the river, the decaying hosts of the television show, the robed figures that commanded the doomed ship. Had we all been seized by the bishops using the same technique? Is this where their power comes from? Are they immortal, or just feeding off the next body, giving their hosts a brief second life? I am in my original life. Why am I available to this control? So Clancy is an exception, not only because he's the only non-bishop able to wield this power, he's the only living being able to be seized by this power while alive. And that's not something that should be lightly brushed off or taken to be a useful plot point of the story. That is very significant and very telling. And yes, there is a difference between seizing and smearing, but I believe Clancy has undergone both. At the very least, he has been seized, because that is very explicitly detailed in the journal. Alright, that was a very interesting entry from Clancy's journal, and it certainly did provide a good deal of helpful information, but it didn't actually provide the answer we were looking for. Namely, how is it that Clancy knew to seize Keons in particular when he began to wield that weapon on the island of Voltsoy? Certainly, from what we know about this power, it requires a certain degree of intention behind it. You can't just send a general wave of energy out into the world hoping to seize an available vessel at random. You have to have a particular corpse in mind, or at least something in mind, as you go to use the power. But Clancy could not have known that Keons was dead, or that his lifeless corpse was available. And again, he makes no mention that he knew this in the journal. Now, because Keons was Clancy's bishop, perhaps you could formulate a theory that they might have met and conspired together to set up this plan before Clancy set out on his propaganda tour on the submarine. And while that sounds like a compelling theory at first, it is sadly debunked by Clancy's own words, because he very clearly describes being surprised by the attack of the dragon on the submarine and completely unaware of the power of seizing. The best plan they could have formulated under those circumstances would have been something along these lines. Keons wishing Clancy the best of luck and telling him he would try to help him any way he could. Which again, would not have given Clancy the information he needed, and we also have no indication whatsoever that such a conversation did take place. But what if Clancy, in his ignorance and his lack of knowledge about how this power worked, did go to use the power without having any particular target in mind, and in so doing, he latched on to the vessel with which he was most closely connected, the body of his former self? It was through this that he was able to take over his former self, or overtake his former self. But again, who is this former self? This Clancy turned bishop named Keons? Well, let us for a moment imagine the cycle that Clancy keeps going through as something along these lines, because it is how it's basically described to us already. Clancy escapes Dima, he's captured and brought back. The banditos break him out, he's recaptured and brought back once again, and this time, he is forced to perform a propaganda tour for the citizens of Dima, alongside a manipulative version of the torchbearer placed there by Nico. This successfully breaks his spirits, so the bishops take this symbol of hope for the people and turn him into one of their own. He becomes a bishop. That is the cycle in its entirety, and this repeats again and again, time after time, almost as if he were stuck in a time loop. That is not the exception. Remember that phrase towards the middle of the I Am Clancy video? I am an escapee, getting better at it with every attempt. The first bishop of Dima was Nico, or Blurryface, created by Tyler as an experiment and become too powerful for Tyler to control. In an attempt to escape this demon of his own creation, Tyler, or Clancy, goes through the first iteration of that cycle and becomes a bishop. This repeats again and again and again. Each time he grows stronger, and each time he finds himself closer to breaking out of the cycle, but each time he fails and joins the ranks of the bishops. Keons is the result of Clancy's most recent attempt to escape the cycle. And being the most recent, he is the strongest. This is why he is the kindest of the nine, and also why he had enough memory of who he was before to know that he should aid Clancy in his escape from Dima. He betrayed the other bishops and helped Clancy escape at the cost of his own life. Thus it is that the phrase "Clancy is dead" is both true and untrue. That Clancy is dead. The current Clancy, the one who we have been following so closely, is the 10th attempt. And he is in violation because he too was supposed to become a bishop and fill in that last open spot in their ranks. That is why they are described as Nico and the Nine. There was always supposed to be a 10th bishop. This Clancy is the last chance, the final run. If he fails, there will be no need for the cycle to repeat again. Blurryface will have accomplished his goal. And this is why we see the FPE numbers, the numbers of the bishops, laid out as they are. 153-986-42 space 14. Clancy was supposed to fill in that missing gap, perhaps with the number 7. It is the only number which does not already appear in that list, and it would be associated with the 7th song off of Blurryface, The Judge, or, as it's otherwise known, Dima.